Welcome everybody to the fourth and final Rabbinic holiday webinar from the year 5776. Previously on Rabbinic webinars, we have had programs on Yom Kippur, Hanukkah, and Purim. And tonight, from New Haven, Connecticut, with Alan Abby-Me in Jerusalem and Professor Christine Hayes in New Haven, Connecticut, we have tonight's program ending our year on Shavuot. And Professor Hayes' topic is Moses at Sinai, God's partner or adversary. Let me tell you a bit about Professor Christine Hayes, and then we're going to turn the program over to her. Dr. Christine Hayes is a faculty member and Kogod Fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. She is the Weiss Professor of Religious Studies and Classical Judaica at Yale University. She has a BA in Religion from Harvard and an MA and PhD from the University of California at Berkeley. In her work at the Institute, she focuses on Talmudic and Midrashic studies. And her most recent work in 2015, What's Divine About Divine Law? Early Perspectives, won the 2015 National Jewish Book Award for Scholarship. Professor Hayes is with us on short notice tonight, and we especially thank her for that. Dr. Ilana Stein-Hain of our New York office was going to be our presenter tonight, but she wasn't feeling well, and Professor Hayes was kind enough to jump in very quickly, almost at the last minute, and give us what I think is going to be a fascinating program. So I want to welcome you, Professor Christine Hayes in New Haven, Connecticut, to our audience online in North America and Israel, and I want to turn the program right over to you.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here. I'm going to ask a very big question and try to answer it by looking at a very small text, or even the gap or absence of information between a couple of verses in the Bible. The question I'm going to ask is, who is the God of the Bible and Jewish tradition, and what does this God want or expect of his people? And in one respect, biblical and Jewish tradition has a ready answer to that question. God has been very clear about what is wanted or expected of his people through the revelation of the Torah, the event that's celebrated at Shavuot. God provided his instructions and directions for the formation and maintenance of a covenant community. But as Rashi notes, the Bible doesn't begin with the giving of the Torah. It might have opened with the giving of the Torah. It might have opened with the words, here's the Torah or teaching of God revealed to Israel at Sinai, followed by a list of commandments and prohibitions and instructions. But it doesn't. The revelation of the Torah is embedded in a larger narrative context. And if we examine the narrative of the giving of the Torah, specifically the dramatic moment in which God prepares to hand the Torah over to Moses, we discover a deeper and more complicated answer to the question, what does this God want or expect, or perhaps even need of his people? We sometimes forget that the revelation of the Torah was almost completely derailed at the last second. That it was not is due entirely to Moses and his ability to respond appropriately at the critical moment, to do what God wanted or expected or perhaps needed him to do. So on the question of what God wants and expects of his people, the story of the giving of the Torah is as instructive as the commandments of the Torah itself. So we'll take a look then at the story and ask what the story of Moses' interaction with God at the moment of the revelation of the Torah have to teach us about what God wants, expects, or needs from his people. So first we have to set the scene, and you'll recall that after delivering Israel from Egypt, God summons Moses to the top of Mount Sinai in order to deliver the terms of the covenant that will bind God and Israel together forever. Moses is there for 40 days and nights. At the end, we read at the end of chapter 31 in Shemot, when he had made an end of speaking with Moses on Mount Sinai, God gave to Moses the 2 tablets of the testimony, the tablets of stone written with the finger of God. So this is the climax of the entire Exodus story, the moment towards which everything has been tending, and yet at this very moment, the Israelites commit the ultimate violation. They turn to the worship of another God. This is the biblical story printed in your handout, which hopefully you all have. And I apologize, looking over it, I see some of the Hebrew got distorted or rearranged in the final versions. So forgive me for that. It was put together rather quickly. What's going to be important here is the space between God's two speeches. The Lord spoke to Moses, hurry down, for your people, whom you brought out of the land of Egypt, have acted basely. I love the way he throws the people into Moses' lap. Your people, whom you brought out of the land of Egypt, have acted basely. They have been quick to turn aside from the way that I enjoined upon them. They have made themselves a molten calf and bowed low to it and sacrificed to it, saying, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Now God hesitates and then speaks again. The Lord further said to Moses, I see that this is a stiff-necked people. Now let me be, and my anger will blaze forth against them, and I will destroy them and make of you a great nation. And then we have Moses' reaction. But Moses implored the Lord his God, saying, let not your anger, O Lord, blaze forth against your people, whom you delivered from the land of Egypt. Notice how he hands the people back to God. Your people, whom you delivered from the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand. Let not the Egyptians say it was with evil intent that he delivered them, only to kill them off in the mountains and annihilate them from the face of the earth. Turn from your blazing anger and renounce the plan to punish your people. Remember your servants, Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, how you swore to them by yourself and said to them, I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven, and I will give to your offspring this whole land of which I spoke, to possess forever. And the Lord renounced the punishment he had planned to bring upon his people. Some important lines here. God's second speech. And in response, Vayachal Moshe et pnei Hashem Elohav vayomer, and so on. Okay, the passage contains many gaps. Scholars use the term gap to refer not just to an absence or a lack of information, but to any feature in a text which demands interpretation for a coherent construction of the story to proceed. So in addition to a blank, which must be filled if the reader is going to make sense of the story, a gap can refer to a contradiction or a repetition or something unexpected or irregular, a hiccup that causes the reader to pause, forces the reader to make a judgment or to supply an explanation to fully understand the text. What are some of the gaps or problems in this text depicting this critical juncture where God is holding the tablets and doesn't want to give them to Moses, or is just in the process of giving them to Moses? The first is a gap in the literal sense of a lack of information, and that occurs between verse 8 and verse 9, between God's first speech and God's second speech. We're not told how Moses reacted to God's first speech. We may suppose that it was his reaction that caused God or motivated God to speak a second time. So it may help to know here a general rule about dialogue in the biblical text. Certain scholars have pointed out that it's very rare in biblical narrative to have two successive speeches by one speaker with no intervening response from the other party. Generally, in biblical dialogue, you have A speak, B speak, A speak, B speak. And it's rare for a speaker to speak twice in a row with no intervening response. It happens maybe a dozen times. And so when it happens, it's significant. I'll illustrate with a text from Shmuel Aleph, 1 Samuel 17. This is where Saul is looking for someone to take on the Philistine giant Goliath. David presents himself. Saul is doubtful that this scrawny young boy is up to the task. And Saul said to David, you're not able to do this, right? And David said to Saul, your servant kept his father's sheep, and when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and I struck him and I delivered it out of his mouth. And when he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and slew him. Your servant smote both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing as he has taunted the armies of the living God. And David said, the Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear, he will deliver me out of the hand of the Philistine. Saul said to David, go, and the Lord will be with you. Notice that David speaks twice in a row. Notice also that his tone changes completely in the second speech. That suggests that there was something in Saul's reaction to David's first speech that prompted David to speak again and to speak differently. We can see in his second speech some clue as to what Saul's silent reaction to the first speech was. David's first speech is full of swagger and braggadocio, and he boasts of his strength and his prowess, and I did this and I did that with these wild animals. I can defeat Goliath as well. And then in the second speech, he says that God delivered him from the lion and the bear, and God will deliver him from the Philistines. And now that he's spoken with appropriate piety and given credit where credit is due, then Saul is favorably inclined. and grants his request to fight the giant with God's help. So presumably, David changed his approach because he saw after the first speech that Saul was completely unimpressed. He reacted in some way. Perhaps he rolled his eyes or turned away or sighed. And in that moment, David realized that his arrogant self-confidence had not found favor with Saul and had not prompted the response he wanted. So instead, he changed tack and he credited God with victory, and Saul approved. In the same way, we have a silence between God's two speeches here in our chapter. And we may imagine Moses behaving in some way that prompted God to speak again. To determine what Moses did or didn't do in that gap, we have to look at the context of God's second speech. How does God change tack? What does God do that indicates that he's responding to Moses's inaction or gestures? And we realize that there's a fundamental ambiguity in God's speech in the second speech. And it's an ambiguity that opens the door for two possible understandings of Moses's reaction to God's announcement that the Israelites have committed idolatry. Two possible understandings of the character and the tone of God's second speech point to two possible understandings of Moses's posture and what it is Moses is doing when he then begins to pray for God to not to kill the Israelites. Let's take this step by step. First, we have to note that God's second speech contains the words, "Let me be." These words imply that after God's first speech, which sort of dismisses Moses, right? He says, "Go and get down, your people have sinned, I'm calling off the covenant." Apparently, Moses made a move of some kind to stop God. Perhaps he starts to defend the people or plead for mercy. And it's because he starts to interfere in some way that God has to say, "Hanichali." It's no use, leave me be, so that my anger can blaze forth, and I can destroy them altogether. If that's so, then God's speech in verse 11 is an imperative. It's a direct command in response to Moses' effort to intervene. Moses' task then is formidable. He made one attempt to intervene and was silenced. And so any subsequent entreaty, like the long prayer that's about to begin in verse 11, I should have said verse 10 before, God's speech in verse 10. His long prayer that will begin in verse 11 is going to be in defiance of a direct order from God not to interfere. Would Moses, in fact, be so disobedient? But there's another possibility. Maybe God hoped to provoke Moses' interference. Maybe God had to do so because after his first speech, Moses, in fact, did nothing. Maybe Moses was too stunned, too overwhelmed by the news of the people's infidelity, paralyzed by fear when God dismissed him. "Go and get down. I'm calling off the covenant. I'm going to kill them all." And that paralysis might have made God very nervous. Perhaps Moses' inaction after the first speech means that he won't stand up to save the people. And so God has to hint to Moses in a second speech that it's time to act. In this case, we have to read God's speech in verse 9 and 10 in a very different tone. Ve'anichali is not "leave me alone," but "leave me alone, Moses, and I will destroy them. So please don't leave me alone." On this interpretation of Moses' implied response is doing nothing, and God's second speech, God is leaving the door open for Moses' intercession. He's signaling that he can be persuaded not to destroy Israel. He's rousing Moses out of inaction and into action. If that's so, then Moses' prayer in verses 11 through 13 isn't done in defiance of God. In his prayer, he's actually taking God's hint. I want to point to a few more interesting gaps in the passage because they'll be important to later rabbinic readers in developing their interpretations of this passage, and we want to turn to the Midrash very soon. First, the word that's used to introduce Moses' speech in verse 11, Vayachal, is an unusual term, and the Hebrew root from which it derives has several very different meanings, and we'll come back to that. We'll see that the rabbis are going to exploit and play with all of these meanings and trying to figure out what role Moses is playing here. Second, the content of Moses's long speech is remarkable. In his intercession, Moses doesn't try to defend the people at all. He seeks only to stop their immediate destruction. And so he appeals to God's sense of responsibility. They're your people, even though God had just called them Moses's people. He appeals to God's vanity, right? What will the neighbors think if you destroy them? The Egyptians will think you brought them out here just to destroy them. And he also appeals to God's promise to the three patriarchs. Zechor la'Avraham, liYitzchak, liYisrael avadecha, right? Remember the patriarchs, your servants, and the promise that you made to them. Asher nishbata lahem. And so the rabbinic readers are going to focus on all of these elements in Moses' speech when they're trying to explain his behavior, his demeanor before God, and the role that he's playing. And the third thing we need to notice is the outcome of Moses' entreaty. It's successful. God changes his mind. And indeed, the language that's used is quite strong. God literally repented of the evil that he had planned to do to his people. So to summarize now the two ways that we can read God's statement, right, leave me alone, in Exodus 32. We can read it as an imperative, let me be, an absolute imperative commanding Moses not to interfere. And the next clause, and my anger will blaze forth, is a statement of purpose. I will destroy Israel, and you, Moses, may not interfere. And on that interpretation, Moses must turn back a seemingly inevitable tide, and he must do so in defiance of God's explicit command not to interfere. And so his lengthy entreaty in verses 11 to 13 becomes, on this interpretation, an act of courageous defiance. Or, verse 10 is a conditional statement. Anichali, right? So if you leave me, now let me be, and my anger will blaze forth against them. If and only if you let me be, my anger will blaze forth against them, and I will destroy them. Read this way, God's speech is not an order to Moses to leave him alone, but a conditional warning that if Moses, that the consequence of letting God be is that Israel will be destroyed. So on this reading, all Moses must do to prevent Israel's destruction is to not let God be. And God is informing Moses he has the power to intervene and prevent God from destroying the Israelites, in which case his prayer is not an act of defiance, but an act of obedience. So is Moses here God's partner or God's adversary? Well, these two interpretations of Moses' activity correspond to two different perceptions of God. According to one perception, God is first and foremost the Redeemer of Israel, intimately and actively involved in the unfolding events of history, responsive to, if not limited by, human action, intention, and entreaty. To dissuade such a God from his stated plan of action is a possible, if delicate, task. It requires tact, diplomacy, and good standing. And Moses has a role to play here as God's partner. Through prayer, entreaty, and persuasive argument, he helps God to actualize his larger purpose, which is to sustain and benefit his people. And God's overlordship is not threatened because Moses simply assists God in the fulfillment of God's own plans and higher purpose. But according to a second perception, God is first and foremost the king and the Lord of creation and history, unlimited by his creatures, whose word is supreme and irrevocable law. To dissuade such a God from his stated plan of action requires doing battle with him and defeating him. In line with this view of God, some traditions of interpretation will place emphasis on Moses as God's adversary. As the defender of Israel, he must struggle to defeat God, and only through deploying various weapons, which can include prayer and entreaty, does he succeed in forcing God to turn back from the course of action he was planning. The imagery associated most commonly with this model is imagery of battle and defeat. And on this view, some limitation of God's overlordship seems to be an inevitable, if perhaps theologically difficult, conclusion. But as different as these two readings are, they have an important element in common. On either reading, God needs humans, whether it be to partner with him or to defeat him. Humans are essential to God's unfolding purposes. So I just want to turn now to the interpretive tradition to see how these two models of Moses, as God's partner or as God's adversary, are developed in Rabbinic Midrash. But actually, the oldest interpretations of the biblical narratives are found already in the Bible itself, as new layers of the biblical text will retell or comment upon older layers of the text. So the story of the golden calf is referenced on more than one occasion in later books of the Bible. We're going to turn first to Deuteronomy, Dvarim 9, which contains Moses' recounting of the golden calf story 40 years later on the plains of Moab. Here he describes what happens. We won't read every part of this in depth. But he describes how he saw the Israelites sinning. In verse 17 on your handout, I took hold of the 2 tablets and flung them from my hands. And then I lay prostrate before the Lord as before, 40 days and 40 nights. I neither ate bread nor drank water because of all the sin you had committed, provoking God. I was afraid that the anger God bore against you was so fierce he would destroy you, but the Lord listened to me that time also. We have this image, va'et napal lifnei Hashem, right? And lechem lo achalti, umayim lo shatiti, right? He's the affliction, the self-affliction. He prostrated himself, didn't eat and didn't drink. He emphasizes his role as the intercessory partner of God. He describes himself as terrified of God's destructive power and engaging in intensive prayer and self-affliction to appease the awful anger. He's an intense supplicant here, interceding in Israel's behalf, pleading and obtaining God's mercy. But a different idea appears in Psalm 106. Here we have another retelling of the story of the golden calf. And we're going to focus on verses 19 to 23, which offer a slightly different interpretation of the Moses-God relationship at this critical moment of the giving of the Torah. They, the Israelites, made a calf at Horeb at Sinai and bowed down to a molten image. They exchanged their glory for the image of a bull that feeds on grass. They forgot the God who had saved them, who had performed great deeds in Egypt, and so on. Verse 23, he would have destroyed them. Vayomer lahashmidam. He would have destroyed them had not Moses, his chosen one, confronted him, stood before him in the breach to avert his destructive wrath. Lule Moshe bachiro amad b'peretz lefanav. The metaphor of standing in the breach is a powerful one. A breach is the opening in a wall or a line of defense through which an enemy can enter to destroy a city. So to portray Moses as standing in the breach before God casts God in the role of an enemy who is bent on Israel's destruction and whose access was blocked only by Moses standing alone. By stepping into the breach, this valiant defender of Israel forcibly stayed God's hand and calamity was averted. He defeated him. So the model here is more clearly adversarial. The language is more clearly battle-oriented. So already the earliest readers of our story in Shemot, in Exodus 32, perceive these 2 possible interpretations of Moses's silent activity in that gap between God's 2 speeches. And the images they provide and the implications of those images for understanding the nature of God are more fully and dramatically developed in later midrashic interpretations of our story. One of the characteristic features of rabbinic midrash, of course, is the reading of verses in the Pentateuch in the light of verses from other parts of the Bible. The rabbis see scripture as a self-glossing literature, one field of meaning, and texts in one place refer to and illuminate texts in another place. So when reading a passage in one of the 5 books of the Torah, for example, the rabbis will typically mobilize a verse from a distant part of the Bible, especially Psalms or Proverbs or Shir HaShirim, Song of Songs. And then they will bring it and they will read the Torah passage in the light of that distant verse that they have mobilized. They use that verse as a kind of key to unlock or open up the verse of the Pentateuch that they're trying to understand. And in so doing, they often will reveal some hidden meaning in the verse. So the juxtaposition of a remote intertext will generate a new interpretation of the story or the passage at hand. And by juxtaposing different remote verses, you generate a variety of different interpretations, sometimes contradictory of one another. But producing these multiple angles of vision on the text and these multiple interpretations seems to be the goal of the Midrashic project, and it happens here. We see this intertextual approach in several Midrashic treatments of Exodus 32. I'm going to start with a relatively straightforward example where the rabbis marshal a verse from Proverbs as the exegetical key for understanding the Moses-God relationship in our story. It's a verse from Proverbs 25, verses 14 and 15, which reads, here it is. Like clouds and wind without rain is one who boasts of a gift never given. With patience, a ruler may be persuaded, and a soft tongue can break bones. Ba'orach hapayim yufuta katzin. With patience, a ruler may be persuaded. what happens when this verse is decoded as a description of God and Moses in the story of the golden calf? That's in text number 1 from Shemot Rabbah 42:1. First, they cite the verse, which is in italics, and then they say, not only did they, the Israelites, make an idol, but they also committed immorality and shed blood. For the merrymaking that tzchok referred to there in the story in Exodus 32, you'll recall it says the Israelites rose up the next morning before the idol, litzchok, litzachek, I think, means idol worship and immorality and the shedding of blood. That word contains all of those sins. How do we know that? And they bring us proofs from other parts of the Bible where we find this root of tzachak, meaning sexual immorality, murder, and idolatry. The Midrash then is followed with a very lengthy lengthy account of Moses' arguments before God on behalf of the Israelites. And every single one of the arguments is refuted. I didn't bother to bring it here. It goes on quite extensively. And yet it says, even though God was able to refute every single one of Moses' arguments in their defense, Moses still somehow succeeded in turning back God's anger. This, they say, is an illustration of our Proverbs verse. Clouds and wind without rain. That's the Israelites. They look so promising, and yet they delivered nothing. And yet Moses was successful in averting the punishment, a proof that with patience a ruler may be persuaded and a soft tongue can break bones. So the idea is that Moses doesn't have a leg to stand on. Israel's behavior is utterly indefensible. To defend her is a hopeless case. The rabbis, in fact, pile it on. They multiply Israel's sins with the golden calf. It included not just idolatry, but murder and sexual immorality, utterly indefensible. And yet Moses refused to give up. He stuck to his task and he simply wore God down. By just not giving up, he got God to relent and repent. So Moses is the wise counselor in this midrash, whose soft tongue can break the resolve of an angry king. But a very different portrait emerges in midrashim that read our story in the light of other intertexts. There's a midrash number 2 in Shemot Rabbah 43:1, which uses Psalm 106:23, the psalm that described Moses as standing in the breach against God during the apostasy with the golden calf. They use that verse in this midrash to interpret the events in our story. Vayachal Moshe, Moses implored the Lord his God. Rabbi Tanchuma bar Abba began this way. He cites Psalm 106:23. He, God, would have destroyed them had not Moses, his chosen one, confronted him, stood before him in the breach to turn back his destructive wrath. What does it mean he stood in the breach before him, before God? Rabbi Chama bar Chanina said, the good advocate, so we're already in an adversarial, situation of a courtroom. The good advocate knows how to set himself against the tribunal. And Moses is one of 2 good advocates who arose to defend Israel and set themselves, as it were, against the Holy One, blessed be he. And these were Moses and Daniel. These were the 2 men who set their faces against the attribute of strict justice in order to argue for mercy on Israel's behalf. So in light of the battle imagery in Psalm 106, this midrash is reading our story as a more dramatic and confrontational moment. Moses' activity is not simple diplomacy, entreaty, or just sheer doggedness. He sets himself against God and does battle with him. So based on a fundamental ambiguity in the original story about Moses' behavior or posture, we see 2 divergent portraits of Moses beginning to emerge, first in the Bible itself and now already in the Midrash. Moses the diplomat, whose patience and speech persuade God, versus Moses the military hero almost, who deflects the attack of a hostile God. And these 2 basic images are subjected to further free development in the sources. We'll turn to some of them now, but before we do, I want to point to the element of wordplay that we'll see coming up again and again. Many of the midrashim we'll read will play on the word that's translated in the English here as implored, but Moses implored the Lord his God, Vayachal Moshe. The root of this word has a number of meanings. I've just listed some of them. I'm sorry for the typo. It should say Vayachal Moshe. The root chal has a range of meanings. It can be related to the meaning for sweetness, as in challah, sweet bread. It can be related to the meaning of profane, chol. And in that context, it also has to do with profaning or annulling a vow, right? This is the root, hechel, to annul or absolve a vow, because people took vows by swearing by the holy name. And so when you broke a vow, you were profaning the name. And if you absolve someone of a vow, you are also profaning something sacred. It's also related to the word for weapons. In modern Hebrew, a chayal is a soldier. Wearing a weapon, girding oneself for war can be also the verb form. All of these potential meanings will be exploited by the Midrashim. So we turn first to interpretations that view Moses as God's partner and intercessor. And these depend on understanding God's speech as a kind of hint to Moses that he has the power to act and affect God's final decision. And yet he's being indirect. Does God think he's being clear? Let's see what the Midrash has to say about this. This is text number 3, which cites a parable to illustrate God's strategy or God's thinking. Shemot Rabbah 42:9. So now let me be. And so they ask explicitly, and was Moses holding fast to God? Was Moses holding on to God, that he has to say, let go of me, leave me be? Of course not. So some other meaning must be intended. We can understand it through a parable. To what can the thing be compared? To a king who was angry with his son, and he had him brought into a chamber and was about to beat him. But then the king cried out from the chamber, let me be, that I may beat him. Now the instructor, the pedagogue of the son, was standing outside, and he thought to himself, if the king and the son are alone within the chamber, then to whom is he saying, let me be? It must be because the king wants me to go in and entreat him on his son's behalf. And for this reason, he says, let me be. He's hinting, I have that power. Someone could stop him. Similarly, God said to Moses, now let me be. And Moses inferred, it's because God wants me to intercede on Israel's behalf. And therefore, Moses began to plead for mercy on their behalf, as it says, Vayachal Moshe. Moses implored the Lord his God. So this Midrash employs a psychological approach in its analysis of God's speech. Just as in the parable, the king's words, let me be, unhand me, cannot be construed literally, in that case, because there's no third party physically present to restrain him. So in our story, God's words, let me be, unhand me, can't be construed literally in this case because God can't be physically constrained. So God's protestation must, in fact, be a veiled call for intervention. And this also solves the problem, by the way, of Moses' apparent defiance. He's not defying God by entreating him. He's, in fact, getting the hint. The presumption at the base of Midrashim that read God's words in verse 10 as a veiled call for action addressed to Moses is that God does not, in fact, want to destroy Israel. He wants to be stopped. It's God's will that Moses act as the divine pacifier, cooling God's temper when it threatens to lash out at Israel by means of prayer. And we see this in the 4th text. This is from Dvarim Rabbah. God said to him, let not the two of us be angry, but when you see me pour hot water, you pour cold. And when you see me pour cold, you pour hot. Moses asked, ruler of the universe, how shall this happen? God replied, pray for mercy on their behalf. And so what did he do? Immediately, Vayachal Moshe. It's not too great a logical leap from the idea that God desires human prayer and entreaty so as to avert or mitigate punishment, to the idea that God needs this human intervention. And some of the Midrashim portray a God who is, in some sense, trapped by his own rules of sin and punishment. This is what we see in Shemot Rabbah 43:5, where Moses seeks to appease God, but God says, is it possible for me not to execute strict justice on them for having broken the commandments? We don't have this text in your handout. I'm simply referring to it because it poses the question so poignantly. Is it possible for me not to do what I said I would do, punish idolaters? God will be forced to punish Israel unless Moses is able to find some escape hatch for him. So responding to various textual elements in the adjacent verses, the Midrash devises a variety of stratagems and attributes them to Moses to help God escape from the consequences of his own rules of sin and punishment. In one case, Moses proposes that God collect the debt to repay, the debt that's incurred through this sin, but collect it from a different source. And in that way, the demands of strict justice are met and Israel is spared. So we see this in text 5. Shemot Rabbah 44:4. Moses pleaded, Lord of the universe, why are you angry with Israel? He replied, because they've broken the Decalogue. He said, well, they possess a source from which they can make repayment. He asked, what is that? And Moses replied, Zachor Avraham, remember that you tried Abraham with 10 trials. Let those 10 trials serve as, compensation for the 10 broken commandments. That's why he said Zachor Avraham. That's why in his speech, he says, remember the patriarchs. He's providing God with a viable alternative. So here the Midrash is playing or drawing upon elements of Moses' speech, specifically his reference to the patriarchs. But the most extreme portrayal of God's dependence, utter dependence on Moses for release from his obligation to punish Israel is found in text number 6, Shemot Rabbah 43:4. This is a great text. Another explanation of Vayachal Moshe, but Moses implored the Lord his God. What does this mean? It means that he absolved, using yachal in the sense of annulling a vow. He absolved his creator of his vow. How? When Israel made the calf, Moses began to entreat God to forgive them. But God said, Moses, I've already taken an oath, back there in Exodus 22, verse 19. Whoever sacrifices to a god other than me shall be proscribed, destroyed. I cannot retract an oath which has proceeded from my mouth. I'm trapped. Moses said to him, Lord of the universe, didn't you grant me the power of annulment of oaths by saying over there in Bamidbar, in Numbers, look ahead a little bit and read a different part of the Torah you're giving me. It says, if a man makes a vow, he shall not break, lo yachel, he shall not break his pledge. Meaning he himself shall not break his pledge, but a scholar can absolve his vow if he consults him. And any sage who gives instruction, if he wants others to accept his decision, he should be the first to observe it. And since you've commanded me concerning the annulment of vows, it's only right that you should seek to annul your vow as you've commanded me to annul the vow of others. We need to do a role modeling session here. Thereupon Moses wrapped himself in his cloak and seated himself in the posture of a sage, and God stood before him like one asking for the annulment of his vow, so hat in hand coming to Moses to get help to release him from the trap he's in. And what did Moses say? Dvar kashe, the text says, a hard thing. Do you now regret your vow? And he said, I regret now the evil which I said I would do to my people. And when Moses heard this, he said, Mutar lacha, it's absolved for you, it's absolved for you. There is neither oath or neither vow nor oath any longer. And this is why the text says Vayachal Moshe, meaning he absolved Hechal, the vow of his creator. The Midrash punningly construes Vayachal, implores as the technical term for annulling a vow. We have this term in Numbers 30, Lo Yachel Dvaro, when a man makes a vow, he may not annul his word. Moses, the Midrash claims, wasn't imploring God, he was absolving God of his vow, his promise to destroy idolaters. God's unable to retract this vow, he's trapped. But Moses is able to find an escape for him. And notice how they also draw beautifully on the language of the biblical story itself. Exodus 32:14, Vayinachem Hashem al hara'a asher diber la'asot la'amo. And in the Midrash, Moses says, do you repent this vow? And God says, yes, I regret the evil that I said I would do to my people, taking those words from the biblical text and making it first person speech of God. It's an astonishing portrait of God is trapped by his own rules of sin and punishment, wanting to be thwarted and dependent upon the ingenious intervention of a human partner in order to rescue him from the consequences of his own decree. In all of these midrashim, Moses can be described as God's partner in the project of sustaining the people of Israel, playing a vital role at the behest of God to ensure that God's demands do not lead to the destruction of the very people he wishes to sustain. In contrast to the midrashim that portray Moses as God's partner in Exodus 32, there are midrashim that develop this idea of Moses as God's adversary. As we've seen, these midrashim are generally based on a reading of God's speech in verse 10 as an absolute imperative not to intervene. conjoined with a serious statement of God's intention to destroy Israel. And in light of that direct order, Moses has to bravely set himself in opposition to God to defeat him. According to some midrashim, Moses is so taken up by the urgency of his task that he abandons his customary posture of respect before God. And here, Vayechal, Moses implored the Lord, is taken as a pun that Moses sort of profaned the Lord or treated him as something not sacred. We see this in text number 7. He, Moses, stood before God with scant respect in order to request Israel's need. Hence, Vayechal. He's treating him almost as something profane and not holy. On the simplest level, this adversarial relationship expresses itself in the form of verbal argument or heated argument. Shemot Rabbah 44:9 is a very long midrash which traces every step of this verbal battle between God and Moses, and it concludes, as you have here in text 8, with a notice of God's defeat. Rabbi Yitzchak said, then it was that God could give no reply, but could only say, you have argued well. And thereupon the Lord renounced or repented of the evil he had planned to bring upon his people. He admits defeat. Prayer is described as the weapon with which Moses girds himself, another pun on Vayechal in the sense of girding himself, taking up a weapon. And so the rabbis read Vayechal Moshe here in number 9 as follows. Thereupon Moses girded himself for prayer, and this is the meaning of Vayechal Moshe b'nei Hashem Elohav. But on the theory that the best defense is a good offense, Moses is depicted as carrying the battle into God's territory. He's not content to simply stand in the breach so as to block God's destructive wrath. He turns God's charge against Israel into an indictment of God himself. We see this in text 10 from the Bavli. This is Brachot 32a, where Moses is listed with Hannah and Eliyahu as having hurled his words, hurled his words at God in prayer. And this is the charge that he makes in your text number 10. Ruler of the universe, it was the gold and silver that you yourself lavished on Israel until they said, die, enough, that caused them to make the molten calf. It was said in the school of Rabbi Yanai, a lion doesn't roar on account of a trough of straw, but on account of a trough of meat. Rabbi Oshaya said, it's like a man who had a cow that was skin and bones. He fed it vetch, and it kicked him. And he said to her, what caused you to kick me? Nothing but the very vetch with which I fed you. So it was the fact that God gave Israel so much gold as they left Egypt that he put in their hands the instrument of their idolatry. And he's ultimately responsible. Similarly, in Exodus Rabbah 43:7, your text 11, we read, Lord of the universe, Moses' speech now to God in his verbal argument with God. Lord of the universe, consider the place from which you brought them out. Wasn't it Egypt where everyone worships lambs? Rav Huna said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, and uses a great mashal or parable here. It can be compared to a wise man who opened a perfume shop for his son in a market frequented by prostitutes. And when the father came and caught him with a prostitute, he began to shout, I will kill you. But his friend was there, and he said, you destroyed the boy, and yet you shouted him. And this is what Moses said, Lord of the universe, you ignored the entire world and caused your children to be enslaved precisely in Egypt, where everyone worships lambs and from whom your children learned. Bear in mind whence you brought them forth. Again, playing on the fact that Moses, when he first begins to implore God, says, why should you be angry? Why should you be angry at the people you brought out of the land of Egypt? What else would you expect from them? But Exodus Rabbah 43:1 finds a different solution to the problem. Rather than taking action that directly opposes God or arguing heatedly and vehemently against him, Moses in this midrash works indirectly to thwart God and mitigate the divine decree. This is your text number 12. Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachman said, he confronted him in the breach, right? It's rather difficult to say that Moses, confronted him in the breach. That sounds rather physical and militaristic. But it can be compared to a king who was angry with his son and took his place on the tribunal and tried him and pronounced him guilty. As he took up the pen to sign the verdict of the court, what did his associate do? He snatched the pen from his hand and broke it in order to appease his wrath. Similarly, when Israel committed that sin, God sat in judgment upon them to condemn them. So what did Moses do? When Israel committed that sin, he took the tablets and shattered them, as if to say, had they foreseen the punishment, they would not have sinned. Moreover, Moses said, it's better that they be judged as having done it unintentionally, unaware of the prohibition, than as if they had willfully committed the act. But some midrashim do extend the battle imagery that we've been referring to beyond the verbal arena and into the physical. And in Dvarim Rabbah 3:15, Moses tells God that he will muster 80 righteous men to stand in the breach against God with him. He first gathers the 70 elders in the first part of the Midrash, and then towards the end of the Midrash, we read that Moses says, add to them Aaron, Nadav, Avihu, Elazar, Itamar, Pinchas, Kalev. That makes 77. He's still short 3. God said to him, but Moses, where are the 3 remaining righteous men to do battle with me? Moses could not find them. And then he said, Master of the universe, if these righteous men, though alive, cannot stand for them, Israel, in the breach, then let the dead do so, meaning the 3 patriarchs. And so here again, the rabbis are drawing on the fact that in his speech, Moses refers to the patriarchs, Zachor, Abraham, and so on. Some midrashim psychologize the drama and the struggle so that it turns out to be a battle, not so much of Moses against God, but a battle or a struggle of God with himself. God's anger becomes dissociated from him. His anger goes forth from him and becomes dissociated from him, and then he does battle with it. In fact, one midrash picks up on the 5 distinct Hebrew words for anger and destruction that are used in the verses that describe God's reaction to the sin of the Israelites. I've given those verses on your handout. They're from Deuteronomy 9 and also from Psalm 106. And I've underlined the words that supply these terms of anger and destruction that are so important to this midrash. Each one of these terms, whether it's af or chama or ketzef or heshmed or ashchata, each one of these words is understood to be a sort of separate hypostasis or separate concretized angelic figure attacking Moses and threatening to destroy the Israelites. And so in the following midrash, this is midrash text number 14 from Shemot Rabbah 44:8, we have God joining with Moses in battle against his own anger and destruction, personified by these 5 angels. This text reads, when Israel committed that sin, 5 angels of destruction came out to destroy them. Anger, af, wrath, ketzef, displeasure, chama, destruction, heshmed, and annihilation, hashchata, these 5 words used in those verses that describe the sin and God's reaction. And Moses said, Lord of the universe, you take on one, I'll take on another. You tackle anger. And there's a nice proof text that I've omitted to say that God rises up against anger. And I'll tackle wrath. And God said to him, see, I've taken on one and you another, but what will you do with the other 3? And Moses replied, there are the 3 patriarchs who can tackle the other. And that is why he mentioned them. The following tradition, though, from Bavli Brachot 32a is the most extreme in its portrayal of Moses bullying God into reversing his plan of destruction. Were it not written in Scripture, Rabbi Abahu said, were it not written in Scripture, it would not be possible to say it. Moses grabbed hold of God like a man grabs hold of his fellow by his collar, his clothing. And he said, ruler of the universe, I won't let go until you are merciful and forgive them. So this review of Rabbinic Midrashim has uncovered 2 striking readings of God's speech in Exodus 32, verse 10, and of Moses's activity in the following verse, whether it's an act of great defiance and courage, doing battle with God as his adversary, or whether it's picking up on God's hint and working with him as his partner. But these divergent readings stem from a pregnant ambiguity in the text of Exodus itself. This ambiguity gives rise to these 2 lines of interpretation in Rabbinic Midrash, and they are fully and freely developed. And I wanted to close with one final interpretation from the Zohar, mystical work, of course, from the 13th century, in which I think we see these 2 interpretations collapse into one. As background, we need to note the Kabbalistic belief that the world is sustained by the harmonic balance of God's 10 sphirot, or attributes, and in particular by the delicate balance between the sphira, or the attribute of justice, which lashes out to punish evil, and the sphira, or attribute of mercy, which tempers that punishment with forgiveness. When the delicate balance between these two sphirot, these two attributes, is upset, the consequences for humanity can be devastating. One of the tasks of the Kabbalist or the mystic is to help maintain the proper balance by bringing out God's attribute of mercy and forgiveness in order to restrain God's attribute of justice in times of human sin. In the Zohar's mystical interpretation of the golden calf story, Moses is, in essence, a mystic, a Kabbalistic mystic, engaged in the struggle against God's attribute of stern justice. And here the adversarial model reaches its most extreme expression as Moses physically restrains God, and yet at the same time, the partnership model also reaches its most extreme expression. The Zohar passage begins by explaining that Mother Shekhinah normally holds God's stern judgment in check. So we see that in the first paragraph of the last source. Even though God threatens and raises the lash, right, to punish, Mother Shekhinah comes and grabs hold of his right arm, and the lash is suspended. Pardon the typographical errors. The sentence is not carried out because both of them share one design, he by threatening and she by holding back his right arm. So we have this image of God with the right arm raised, ready to lash, but at the same time, Mother Shekhinah is holding it there, threatening, and yet the lash never descends. However, the Zohar explains that when Israel committed the sin with the golden calf, they drove Mother Shekhinah away, and now the arm is threatening to, in fact, come down with the lash. And so we'll read our last part of our last text. However, because of the sin, Mother Shekhinah, who always grasps the arm of the king and suspends the lash, was not there, and Moses had to take her place. As soon as the Blessed Holy One penetrated him, he saw clearly. 3 times he penetrated him. O Moses, faithful shepherd, how mighty is your strength, how great is your power. 3 times he penetrated you. As it is written, now leave me alone. That is 1. My anger will blaze against them, and I will consume them. That is 2. And I will make you into a great nation. That is 3. Sort of 3 provocations moving Moses to do what he had to do. The wisdom of Moses was in these 3 points. He grasped his right arm in response to, leave me alone. He grasped his left arm in response to, my anger will blaze against them and I will consume them. And he embraced the whole body of the king in response to, and I will make you into a great nation. Having embraced the body, both arms on this side and that, he, God, could not move to any side at all. This was the wisdom of Moses. He knew the various points of the king, where to be firm on each one. He acted in wisdom. The Zohar's interpretation of Exodus 32 casts Moses in the role of God's technician. Israel's sin caused the restraining influence of Shekhinah to go into eclipse, and Elohim, the attribute of wrath and punishment, was set free. Moses, as Kabbalist, had to work to correct that imbalance and avert destruction. The Zohar extols the mighty strength and the great power of Moses, by means of which he pinioned God, holding firmly in precisely the right places, so as to neutralize completely his destructive capability. And yet, even as it adopts the adversarial battle imagery in its interpretation of Exodus 32, so that God is completely neutralized or paralyzed, the Zohar blends with it the idea of God's hinting to Moses, of God's wanting and needing to be restrained. And the result then is the following complex portrait. God recognizes that his attribute of strict and true judgment, his punishing wrath, is spinning out of control. Unable to restrain himself, he appeals to Moses, who then rises courageously to oppose and restrain God. The image is a rich and conflicted one. God engages Moses to stop God from doing what he must but does not wish to do, and God is only too glad to be defeated by his creatures. Our review of rabbinic interpretations of a highly charged moment in the golden calf story has unearthed powerful and moving images that capture diverse aspects of the complicated relationship between God and humanity. But perhaps the portrait that emerges most powerfully from these sources is not, after all, the portrait of Moses, caught somewhere, alternatingly perhaps, between the roles of God's partner and God's adversary, but rather the portrait of God. Taken as a whole, these sources have presented us with the poignant and paradoxical portrait of a conflicted God who knows what he ought to do and has said he will do, but who seeks to undermine his own execution of strict justice, his own performance, and acting on his promise. A God who must learn what humanity is capable of and adapt his expectations accordingly. A God who relies ultimately on the input of human beings to assist him in the governance of his world. A God whose overlordship is in no way threatened or diminished by the fact that he wants and needs to listen to the voice and demands of his creatures, to be convinced or forced to set aside his anger, to sometimes regret, and with our help, change course. Chag Sameach.
Thank you very much, Professor. We have a few questions. We have a few minutes, and we'll try and get to some of them. But the first thing I wanted to ask is that you described as something of an astonishing portrait of a God trapped in many ways, and particularly what struck me was God trapped by God's own vows and, in fact, dependent upon a human for absolution. So isn't this God that you portrayed quite a different one from the more traditional images of the divine that maybe we've been taught or that is still taught in terms of strength and power and distance? And here is a God, as you said, I think you said, coming hat in hand for a human to absolve.
Asking for our help. It is. And I think one of the things I encounter so much in my teaching, particularly when I teach a Bible course, the introduction to the Hebrew Bible, students will say to me, this makes no sense. God doesn't act this way. God is omniscient. Why does he need to go down to investigate complaints on earth? God is omnipotent. Why can't he do what he wants to do? Why is he thwarted? Why couldn't he create humans so that they wouldn't have sinned in the garden? God never changes his mind. God is one and the same. So how can Exodus 32 verse 14 say, Vayinachem Hashem, that God changes his mind? And what I remind students is that that image of God is really an outcome of a certain Western philosophical tradition that's grounded very much in Greco-Roman notions of the divine as that which is static, immutable, unchanging truth. And that those notions really come from a different cultural concept and a different kind of conversation. God is the unmoved mover, and one in which perfection is understood to be stasis, unchanging, static reality. And that is not the God that we meet in biblical and Jewish tradition. The God that we meet in biblical tradition is a dynamic God. This is a God who is intimately involved in creation and interacting with creation, learning about the creatures that he has created, changing course in response to their actions and their reactions to his actions. So to my mind, this is in fact the traditional notion of God, but unfortunately we sometimes wear a set of lenses that have been handed to us through the Western philosophical tradition coming out of the Greco-Roman philosophical tradition, which speaks of the divine in very different ways. And we sometimes then read biblical stories or midrashim and are sort of shocked or scandalized by what we see there. You know, how could they describe God in this way? Isn't God weak, or doesn't this impugn God's authority and divinity to see him as as being someone who negotiates or who could be talked out of things or who adjusts himself? And I think not. I think that for the Bible and for the rabbis, what's divine about God is precisely not that he's static. That which is static is dead, but precisely that he's dynamic and alive and interacting with humans and very much in need of their input so that he can make the necessary adjustments to be the kind of God and ruler and king and father and friend and partner that they need. He needs good sparring partners. I like the phrase sparring partner because it captures the idea both of partnership but also of challenge and being an adversary sometimes. So God needs sparring partners.
Well, in light of that, I have a question from David Khrushchev of Congregation Avas Israel in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And he was from early on in your talk, and it says that might Moses be reacting to God's use of the phrase, your people, and God responds, stiff-necked people, as if to say, it's you and me, Moses, it's you and me against them. So here's God negotiating with Moses, pitting the two of them together against the Israelite people. How does this relationship play out between Moses and God, and then Moses and the Israelites?
Yeah, this is so great. This is sort of God's modus operandi up till now, right? He creates humankind, he's disappointed. And so in Genesis 6, he sees that the desires of men's heart are evil, and so he decides to he focuses on one person, Noah, and wipes out everybody else. Let's start again now with Noah. He's going to be disappointed again as the generations continue. They build the Tower of Babel. They turn away from God. And so God says, that's it. I've had it. I'm going to find one person and just ignore everybody else. Like Abraham will be the one, right? So he makes a covenant with Abraham. And then Abraham's seed. And now here we come again. This is the third time. God is disappointed. He's disgusted. And once again, he wants to change dance partners. And he says, Moses, these people are no good either. Let's get rid of them. I'm going to start with you. And this is when Moses says, no. You can't keep doing this. I'm going to hold the line. And you have to hold the line. That's why it's so huge. None of it would have been pulled off. None of it would have happened without Moses literally standing up to God and saying, you can't keep doing this. You can't keep throwing people aside and starting again with high hopes. You have to accept the Israelites for good or for evil. They're going to disappoint you. They're going to do terrible things, but you've got a compact and you've got a covenant, and they're yours and you're theirs. And that's it. No more changing partners and dancing. And you've made me this offer and you think it's too good to refuse, but I refuse it. And it's significant that at the end of the story, right, he says, everybody or nobody, if you're going to wipe them out, then blot me out from your book as well. You can't divide and conquer that way. I'm standing with the people. So I think you're absolutely right to pick up on that. This throwing the people back and forth is very significant. It's God's effort to disown them, Moses' effort to hand them right back to God and say, no, they are yours and you have to stick with them and don't try to divide and conquer. You can't set them aside and start again with me. You tried that once with Noah. You've tried it with Abraham. You're going to try now again for a third time. No, you're stuck with them forever. I'm with them and you blot me out from your book as well if you're going to destroy them. Or you forgive them and you realize it's an imperfect world and you have to just be with this people and be true to your word.
We've just about run out of time, so I want to just thank you again, Professor, for this program. I want to remind all of our viewers that we have recorded this video and we're going to post it up on our YouTube channel and on the Hartman website as soon as we can. So we certainly will hope to get it to you if you want to review it again before the Shavuot holiday in a week and a half. This has been an event with a session tonight with some large ideas for the very significant and, of course, challenging holiday of Shavuot, at which, as David Hartman and many of us have said at the Institute in the past, that Shavuot is when the people of the Jewish people really do become the people of the book. All-night study, whether it's in Jerusalem or near town. We hope that you will get something from this program and other material on the Institute, from the Institute for your studies. And again, I want to thank everybody. This is the final program of the 5776 Rabbinic webinar series. We have received many comments about you on the format as well, and we will address those. We'll think about those as we go forward and plan our next year programs. And again, thank you very much in New Haven, Professor Christine Hayes of Yale University and the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. And Chag Sameach to one and all, and so long from Jerusalem.
Thank you.